Hills, we just want to welcome you to our community. We believe that God has brought you here for a reason. It's not an accident that you're here. You may feel like it was. You're like, man, I feel like a train wreck. That's actually how I feel. That accident has been derailing my life, but trust me, we've all been there, and we believe that God has brought you here today for a better story and a better purpose. And so if you feel like you are being called into this community, one of the easiest ways you can get plugged in is if you just turn in that listening guide, that card that somebody handed you when you came in this morning. It's an easy way for you to just get plugged into our community. Just fill that out, drop it in the offering box at the end of the service, and we will get you plugged in. We also have something called Discovery this morning, which is a class immediately after the service where if you're new to Green Hills, you can come, hang out, meet some cool people that are plugged in at our church. You can have some free food, and it's a way for you to just get to know a little bit more about what God is doing at Green Hills. So please consider coming to that. I think it's an incredible opportunity to get plugged in at our church. Now, today, as we walk through our study, we're going to be looking at this reality that we've been looking at every week in this series, which is that God has called us to be people who live as exiles in the world, that we've been called to live as salt and light in Nashville, Tennessee for the glory of God, which is an incredible concept. Now, often, we as Christians kind of believe that we live in this Christian nation, this like bubble where everybody's a Christian, but Leonard Sweet said this. Leonard Sweet's a famous missiologist, guy who looks at trends overall in the country and in the nation, and he said this, is that the American church needs to realize that the 21st century will be a century filled with away games, that we can't live expecting to have a home crowd cheering us on in the way that we live our life. What that means is that for most of American history, we've lived in this culture where we've kind of had the home crowd at our back, where they've been like cheering for every move that we've made. Like, yay, go church, go God, we're all Christians. But now we're playing on the road, and it's a whole different ballgame. For many of us, we live in a world now where the church is seen as outsiders, as strangers, as people who live differently and peculiarly. And so as Christians, we need to live according to those rules and play on a different playing field now. And so today, as we look through this story, we're going to see some important clues on how to live as people who are playing on the road. So we're going to be looking at the story of these three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they live a life that is countercultural for the glory of God. And I hope that you're going to find some important clues on how to live in your workplace, in your home, in your community, because Jesus has placed you there for a reason. Now, we're going to go right to our text. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. We're going to start right there at the beginning. It says this: King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent out to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples and nations and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, today, as we look at our study, we're going to find that there is an event that's happening in the nation of Babylon that causes a great deal of angst among the people. Now, most of the people go along with it, and yet three young men stand up and dare to be different. Now, our story begins with this king, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he's got a funny name. It hasn't really translated into modern culture, right? Nebuchadnezzar, no one's really named their kid that. But Nebuchadnezzar was a boss, okay? He's absolutely an impressive person in any way you could slice it. He's somebody who's burst on the scene, has established the first world empire. His empire is called Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar has accomplished more in his life than any of us will ever accomplish, right? He conquers almost everything that is known. So he sets up this kingdom. And as he has set up his kingdom, he's conquered and swallowed up nations and peoples in his wake and brought them into his nation. He's done a really good job of making all these nations he's conquered Babylon. He's kind of set up a system to kind of teach them how to be a Babylonian. And here you find him actually trying to establish his kingdom so that it'll never end. So what he does is he sets up a statue in his capital city on this big plain. It's a really tall statue. It's 60 cubits, which is about 90 feet tall. And he sets it up in the statue in the middle of this plain, and invites all his leadership, this big list that I read. You guys may have been snickering when I was reading it. It's satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of this statue. So he brings all the leadership of his empire to this big open plain and tells them, listen, this is what we're going to do. We're going to worship the statue, so I'm going to play some music, and when I do, I want everybody to bow down and worship it. And here's the catch. If you don't, you're going to get thrown into a fiery furnace, so you're going to die in fierce agony. So which one do you want to do? Do you want to just bow down when the music plays, or do you want to die? So for most of us, we'd be like, I'll just go along with the flow. Dying sounds like a pretty bad result, for my civil disobedience here. I really don't have very much invested. I'm just going to, when the music plays, I'm just going to bow down to the statue. I mean, it's going to take no time at all, and then I can get on with my life. So that's basically what's happening here, right? Now, there's some layers that I want to just point at here. So there's some backstory. Last week, Pastor Justin taught us a message out of Daniel chapter 2. And as he did, so he told us about a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had had, where he had seen a vision of a statue, very similar probably to this one, where he saw the statue come to an end. And the statue was built of a lot of different metals. The top was gold, the chest and arms were of silver, the belly was of bronze, and the legs were of iron, and the feet were of clay and iron. And at the end, a huge rock comes and just smashes the whole thing to smithereens. You know what Nebuchadnezzar is told? He is told that this is a kind of a chronology. It's like a world history encapsulated in this statue. And that Nebuchadnezzar's part of the history is just the head, which is made of gold. And Nebuchadnezzar hears that his kingdom is going to end at some point because he's going to be taken over by the following kingdom. The Persians are going to come and take him over. And eventually the whole thing would go away because there would be God's kingdom that would come against it and overwhelm all of it, which is the stone. And Nebuchadnezzar hears this, and as every good emperor never wants to see his empire ever go to end or come to an end, he decides to put an end to that story. And so he builds an entire statue made of gold. It's no, it's not just the head. The whole thing is gold, okay? Because this sucker's never going to end. And then what he does is he brings all his leadership in to bow to the statue because he's trying to even push back on God himself to say, no, my kingdom's never going to end. And I'm going to make sure every single person in my kingdom realizes this. It's a way for me to even say, who's not with me? I'm going to make sure that I root you out right now by this public show of allegiance because he wants to make sure that his kingdom will never end. And in this, Nebuchadnezzar is a picture of our own life, honestly. We can give Nebuchadnezzar a bad rap. We can say, hey, look at this foolish man trying to stand up against God, think that his kingdom will never end. Doesn't he know that he's mortal just like everybody else? His life someday will end. We all know that, right? Every single person's life will end at some point. So you're a big dummy, Nebuchadnezzar. But we do the same thing in our own culture, in our own life, right? We try to think that we'll live forever. We live that way. We live for this present age all the time. And we hope that there'll be something that'll extend our life, right? We try to take some pills to make ourselves healthier. We exercise, we eat well or not so well, and we try to make sure that we extend our life as long as we can. And we live as if this world will never end. And Nebuchadnezzar is someone who is demanding the allegiance of all the people to make sure that his kingdom will never end. And this is the first thing I want you to know today. As somebody who has claimed Jesus Christ as your king and as your Lord and Savior, that's what it means to be a Christian, you're going to be someone who's going to be forced to give allegiance to one kingdom or the other. There will come a day that you'll have to make a choice. how will I live my life, and to whom will I give my allegiance? And here's the trick. That choice is today. It's not someday in the future. You need to choose today how you're going to live. And so if you're going to live as a citizen of heaven in the world, the first thing you need to know is you need to give your first allegiance to God. You need to give your first allegiance to God. That's what God is calling you to. There will be opportunities to give your allegiance to other things, but your first allegiance is going to be to God. And you're going to be asked of Jesus to do that on the day that you give your life to him. That's something he wants from you. He wants all of you. He wants all of your allegiance, because there's going to be a day that you're going to have a conflict with the current reality that you're in, which is our second point, is that you need to be prepared for the conflict between God and the world. You need to be prepared that there will be a day that you will have a conflict between this present world and your future inheritance that God is offering you. There will be a conflict. You can't get around it. You can't just be like, well, hopefully that's only for pastors or people in third world countries who live in oppressive government regimes underneath those, and they're trying to spread Christianity. But I'm never going to have to do that because I live in Nashville, Tennessee, or Brentwood, or Franklin, or wherever you live in this city. That's a wonderful city. But you need to know that every single one of us has to make a decision as to who we're going to serve, and we're going to be people who will enter into conflict with the world. So, verse 8, our story starts to turn. It says, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you, and they do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So our story begins to change. There's this moment where the king plays the music, and it kind of happens offset here. Apparently there's some actions happened between these two passages I just read, where the king says, all right, everybody go worship as soon as the music happens. And so the music plays, and everybody falls on their faces except for three dudes. And they're like, no, we're cool. We're just going to stand right here. It's awkward. Everybody else is on their face, but we're not going to do it. And as the events continue to move forward, there's some tattletales who come and they go, hey, so king, it's really weird. We don't want to be the bearers of bad news, but there's these three guys who aren't doing what you said. And they're right over there. Right? Now, can you imagine for just a moment what it would have felt like to be these three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We don't know where Daniel is, by the way. He's completely absent in the story. We're assuming the best about him, by the way. It's like maybe he's sick in bed. We don't know. But right now, we have these three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and everybody's looking at them. Like most of us hate to have any kind of public attention on us, right? There's some of us weird like me who don't mind standing in front of people, but most people, you'd rather die than have everybody listen to you speak or be in front of people, right? Like there's a lot of us in this room, I bet, if we just started polling, you'd be like, no, I'd actually rather die than be seen. Like really, it's not really even a hard choice. Like I don't really want to have any attention on me whatsoever. Some of you in the room are like, that's never me. Like, please, spotlight. That's why I'm in Nashville. Don't you know? I'm a big deal, right? So, and yet in this moment, all these men are looking directly at these three young men, these three boys from a little nowhere town called Jerusalem, who all of a sudden have the entire attention of the empire fixed upon them. And it's not for great reasons, right? No one's going, hey, you guys are awesome. They're going, why aren't you towing the line? Why aren't you guys doing exactly what everybody else is doing? And they're forced into this incredible conflict where they have to choose what they're going to be about, who they're going to follow, what's life going to look like for them going forward. And so now we find the story pushing us into this real strong confrontation. Oh, I got to watch out here. Between the king and the people. The king and these three young men. So let's continue. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" So things get a lot more serious. They go from bad to worse. These three young men are brought in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he kind of does the parent thing where he's like, "Okay, last warning." Have you ever done that with your kids, by the way? You're like, "Okay, I'm really serious now. I'm going to count to three. I counted to three before, and it didn't work, so I'm doing it again. All right. I don't want to do this, but if you don't bow down, I'm going to throw you in the furnace. So I'm going to play the music again, guys, and just help me out. Maybe you didn't hear it. You're from like Jerusalem, but maybe you didn't hear it right. But like when the music plays, you're supposed to bow down, and I'm really mad, so please do that." And so the young men are actually brought from a place where it seemed like they were unobserved. I mean, there's a lot of people who would notice if they didn't bow down. So now they're actually in front of the most important and powerful person they've ever met, their boss, the king of Babylon, and he's forcing them now to make a really, really hard decision. And I think this is something that we need to just kind of press into just a moment, is that, guys, following Jesus is a difficult assignment. It is. I mean, there will be times where it's easy to kind of just skate by and act like everybody else, but there are times where you will be face to face with a difficult decision that will cost. And Jesus promises that. He promises that. He says, in this world you will have trouble. That doesn't sound like it's something that will just maybe happen to you. He says this to his disciples as he's about to leave. He says, "In this world you will have trouble." But then he says, "Fear not, for I have overcome the world." So there's always this conflict between the world and the kingdom of God, that there's something that every single one of us will face as people who follow Jesus, that we will face trouble and we will face opposition. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's probably because of one of two reasons. One is that it will happen, you just haven't experienced it, and it's coming. Or two, you're not living for Jesus. Like you're just kind of ducking every opportunity you have to be Jesus in your community. Because if you stand for the things of Jesus, at some point you're going to stand out. And so there will be a moment, if you're going to follow Jesus, that the conflict will come. And in the middle of the conflict, the way that you answer says a lot about the God that you serve. Now, the way these young men answer is absolutely remarkable. And this is the centerpiece of this entire message, what we're going to read next. The response of these young men is the entire punchline to this story. In fact, this is the only time Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say an entire word in the whole book of Daniel, by the way. Okay? There's very little that they say. I guess they're men of very few words, but the one thing they do say is just a home run, okay? So let's read it. This is what they say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." So they're basically like, don't even play the music. That's basically what they say. Like, we don't need to go through the charade where they play the music and we don't bow down again because we're just not going to do it. So they're just stop now. And they say this, verse 17. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. These guys have courage that is unfathomable. Do you see what they said? Like, king, you don't need to play music because we're already resolved in what we're going to do, but here's what's going to happen. If you want to throw us in the fiery furnace, our God who we serve is going to be able to deliver us out of that furnace. That's a huge claim. Like, yeah, we're not going to follow your gods, O king, because our God is better and he's going to deliver us out of the furnace. So our God is a God of miracles who can do miraculous things, and he will come to our aid and he will protect us. That's an incredible claim. In fact, in our current modern age, most of us would rather discount that there's a God of miracles at all. And yet, over and over again, Christians believe that God is a God who can do miraculous things. But here's the thing that we fail sometimes as Christians, is that we only want to hope in what God can do for us, right? Like, hey, we're going to just have faith, and of course, God's going to pick us up and take care of us. But what happens here? These guys go, yeah, God, he can deliver us. But verse 18 says, but if not, he doesn't save us, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They say, listen, God can save us, but even if he doesn't, that's not going to change the way that we follow him. Isn't that an incredible claim? That even if God does not come through for us in the way that we want him to, we are going to follow God anyway, because his goodness does not depend on how it turns out for me. His goodness is beyond that. And I'm going to trust in his sovereignty and who he is and what he wants to do and what he wants to accomplish in my life, regardless of my own personal consequences, which is our third thing today. We want to live as citizens of heaven in the world. We need to choose to follow God regardless of the consequences. Sometimes we want to follow God as long as he gives us the result that we want. I'll follow you if you give me the wife that I want. And I've got her picked out. She's right over there. God, I'll follow you if you give me the story I want, the success that I desire. God, I'll follow you if you heal me of this particular sickness or the depression that I'm carrying or the way that I feel about my life. If you take care of this, the prayer that I continue lobbying towards you, then I will follow you. But following Jesus means giving up the right to determine the way the story works and the way that it's going to end. And that's the hardest thing for all of us, because I think all of us at some level, we're control freaks. Like we just want to like tell the story. We want to be the ones who's in charge, which ultimately reveals our desire to be God. Which means that we're saying, God, I don't trust the way that you have laid out my life. I don't trust the way that you've made me. I don't like it. So I want to rewrite it the way that I want it to work. But these young men, faced with this momentous moment where they've got to figure out like what life is going to look like for them, whether they're going to live or die, they're like, we're following God regardless because we think he's good and he's declared to be good. We've seen him be good. And even if it goes badly for us, he's still good. That is a place of incredible faith. And I see it in Christians all the time who are like, man, listen, I'm going to be somebody who's going to follow God even if it means the end of my life. God, you've given me cancer. I'm going to glorify you with this cancer even though I may never be healed from it on this side of the earth. My obedience is not conditional on my healing. This is difficult. And it has to happen before you enter into the storm of life that's going to make you question your faith. To say, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust him. I'm going to trust him with my life. Now, how do these guys do this? I mean, they've lost everything. They've lost every mooring of life. They've lost their home, their language, their friends, their family. They've lost their future. They are completely uprooted in a place that is not home. How are they able to do this? Well, I want to put forward two reasons. One is probably because they had seen God work in the past, and so they trusted that God would work in the future. Now, here's the hard thing for me is that when I feel fear, I just only look at all the things that are out in front of me, and I'm like, man, I don't know how that's going to work in the future, and so I start having a lot of doubt. But when I start looking at God's faithfulness in the past, then I can have an anchor to point me forward in the future. So when you're in a point like this, where you're wondering if God's going to come through, look at the past record that he's placed in your life and in the life of God's people. That's one of the reasons why this story is even here, because God is showing you how he works. So it's not just even your own story where you can have confidence in what God has done, but the story of the saints that have gone before you. That God has shown you a record of his goodness here in this text. That God will walk with his people. You can hold on to that. That's why we read our scriptures. We see God's faithful journey with his people through their life, through the ups and downs, through a bunch of people who are a mess. God walks with them, and we can put our hope in him because he has walked with others just like us. Now, the second thing that you find them having is friends. They have each other. It's a beautiful thing that God gives us a friend in a time of trouble. So I was looking at this study the other day, and I thought it was fascinating, so I wanted to share it with you. But the study revealed that most of us are terrified to disagree with our friends, which we all knew, right? Like, that's what junior high was. Nobody wanted to, dress different. We all wanted to be original as our friends. So we wanted to, all fit in, but all be, unique. But that's really hard to do, right? Hipsters are trying to do that in the whole city. You guys have seen how that's worked out. They all look the same, but they're all unique. So here's how this works, though, in real time. So they did this study where they had everybody in on it but one dude, which is always a lot of fun for that one person, right? So they brought this guy into a room and they said, okay, tell us what color this piece of paper is. And the paper was red. But every single person in the room said it was blue. Guess what the guy said? It's blue. And they did this over and over again with the blind studies. Bring somebody in, but everybody would be like, the paper is blue. And the guy's like, it's obviously red, but am I wrong? All these people can't be wrong. So he would also say that it was blue, even though it was red. As obvious as it could possibly be. And none of these people are colorblind, by the way, okay? So this guy's like, okay, I guess it's blue because everybody's saying it is, but I think it's red. Am I going crazy? But what they found was that the one factor that would make that one person say that it was the color that it really was, that it was red and not blue, was if they had one person who agreed with them. If they had one other person who was like, yeah, it's red, they'd go, I'm not nuts, and this is true. And all y'all are lying. And in that study, there's a simple fact that's just illustrated in life, is that having someone who's in the foxhole with us, who believes the same things we do, is a stabilizing influence in the way that we see the world. Just having one person who can be community with us and say, you're not crazy, you're seeing the world the right way, everybody else is seeing it wrong, will allow people to make the right choice. And Christians, this is why God gave us the church. He gave us a body of believers who have also been transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit, who also see the world with spiritual eyes, who can also say, listen, you're not crazy. God's going to get you through this, and he's going to be with you, and he's going to walk with you. And God gave them each other for that reason. Is that beautiful? So Christian, if you're thinking you can do the lone wolf Christian thing and you just do your own way, you're doing it wrong. That's not the way God set it up. You need brothers and sisters that know you and love you and will call you to follow him, even when everybody else is saying that the paper's blue. You know it's red. You have friends who'll say, yo, walk with me in the way that you ought to walk. Now, as we continue in our study, you're going to find this decision they make be something that changes their destiny. So let's keep reading. Nebuchadnezzar does not take this confrontation well. Apparently, he rarely gets told no. So verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because of the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. They go through with it. The young men are thrown into the furnace. The king is so angry, he actually orders them to make it even hotter, 7 times hotter. So they crank up the heat. He takes the best guys he's got, his best soldiers, binds these 3 young men, throws them in the furnace. The furnace is so hot that even the guys who are throwing them in the fire die. And then God moves. In this moment where nobody really knows what's going to happen, God moves and he saves. Verse 24 says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. And he answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. See, in this moment, God starts doing something amazing. They're thrown in the furnace, a furnace that's so hot that anybody who gets close to it is killed. But these 3 young men don't die. They're actually saved. They actually start walking around in it. And there's a 4th that shows up. And the king becomes amazed by what God is doing in this moment. And we find these young men doing something that's pretty powerful. They embrace God's promise of salvation for his people, and as a result of it, they get to see God do that. See, when they say, we're going to trust God, what they're doing is they're embracing what God has already promised for his people, which is that he's going to provide for them and save them, which is what happens. Their declaration was one not just of saying, we're pushing back, king, but it's one of claiming God's promise. And in this moment, they embrace God's promise, and then they get to experience it. So what happens is that God sends a deliverer with them. There's a 4th person that enters into the story. Now, some people wonder like who this person is, right? Like theologians like, so there's 3 of them, and then there's a 4th. Who's this 4th? Who the king says is someone that looks like a son of the gods. Like, is this Jesus? Well, we don't know for certain. It's definitely a possibility. It could be a theophany, which is an image of God the Father walking among the earth at that time. It could be an angel that God sent. We don't know, but we do know that this is a picture of what God does for his people, is that he offers salvation to them and he dwells among them when they go through their trials, which is what God does here, is he sends someone to be with them. And he brings them to a place where they enter into God's salvation because of their faith in him. This is a picture of what the gospel does. See, sometimes when you look at this story, if you're a skeptic, you're like, okay, did this really happen? Like, I mean, there's like this fire and people are thrown in a fire. Every time I've seen anything thrown in a fire, all I saw was that thing got burned up. Like, what is this story really about? Like, do you think this story is going to make me believe in Jesus? Like, it's pretty far-fetched. But you need to know, if you're somebody who's a skeptic, first of all, we're really glad that you're here. Like, this is a place for you. There are many people who've walked this path before you, who have come into this room, who have not believed in the gospel, who have not believed that there's a God who can do miracles, and have been changed by that same God because they've experienced them here. So you're in good company. A lot of us are skeptics by nature. But secondly, this story is not here to teach you about the way that the world really is, to make you actually believe because of this ancient story. This story is actually written to those of us who do believe, calling us to be people who trust God with the salvation that he's offering us, because this is a picture of what God does when we trust him. He comes and enters into the fray with us and walks with us. This is a calling for those of us who are followers of Jesus to believe the gospel, that God is not a God who's far off when we're in our trials, but he's somebody who comes and dwells among us because he knows that we need him and he will not abandon us. This is a picture of what the gospel does. Because here's the deal. When you hear about these young men being brave and courageous and being bold, doesn't that make you want to be that way? Right? Don't you want to be like, I could have done that? Or give me an opportunity to do that, God. That's beautiful. That's what the gospel does. It calls us to being people who are courageous. But here's what I know about myself and probably about you, is that there's no way we could be courageous like this on our own. The only way we can do this is if God comes and changes our heart so much so that we love him more than we love the present age and the present world. That's the only way we can get there, which is through the person of Jesus, which this fourth person points us to. That Jesus is the one who gives us the courage, and then he walks us through the trials and the temptations and the difficulties as we embrace God's promise of salvation for his people. And this is what God is calling us to. But lastly, this is the last thing I want us to press into today, which is we need to declare the reality of God's supremacy to the nations, which is what all of this is about. That God is calling us to declare the reality of God's supremacy to the nations. Now, when I wrote this, I went back and forth on this point, to be honest, because I thought about just taking out this reality part. Like, that we just make it really simple, like declare God's supremacy to the nations. I thought that would be a great way to end this, because that's what we're about, right? We're called to declare God's supremacy to all the nations. That he's the only one that we should worship as the one true God. Through Jesus, we have access to that God, and that he is supreme. But the reason I kept this phrase, the reality of it, is because it doesn't seem that way sometimes, right? The world can seem like there's no God, that it's just a bunch of atoms just floating through the world. In fact, the world tells us that that's the way the world really is. But we're called to declare a different reality, which is that God is among us and with us, and we are sent to our city and to the nations to declare that, which is what happens here. At the end of our story, I'm going to just read it. That's what Nebuchadnezzar does. He declares that God is better than his gods because of the obedience of his people. Verse 26 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. You see, he starts calling this insignificant small God the Most High God. He changes his attitude towards God because of the obedience of God's people. And then pick it up. It says, Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who's able to rescue in this way. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What he does is he basically goes, listen, there's only one God, and it's that one. And anybody who speaks bad about him will be torn limb from limb, which is like, I guess he can't help himself. He's just a bloodthirsty guy, right? Like, I always think it's funny. He's like, oh, he's got this big breakthrough, and anybody who doesn't do it will die. Like, he just can't help himself. He's not there yet. But here's what you find over and over in this story is that these four young guys, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are placed in Babylon so that everybody will see that there is just one God, the real one. And everybody that they're in contact with has a front row seat to see God work through four really normal men who are scared and alone, but trust in God. And even the most powerful person in the world sees it and is changed. The most powerful nation in the world sees it and is changed. And God wants to use you in the very same way. Look, the Bible is filled with very broken people doing extraordinary things. God uses people like that. He can use you to change the culture of your company from being one that is secular and far from God to being one that trembles at the sound of his name. And he can use you to do that. God can use you to change the culture of your campus for the glory of God. Why do we say this? Because over and over again, this is what God has done. He's taken normal people and changed their context. So would you trust God with that? It all begins with just trusting that God is real, that you want to follow him regardless of the consequences, which is why we're going to highlight that here at the end. It's just saying, God, I'm in no matter what. I believe firmly that if there's a group of people that just say that, God can move powerfully through their life. Would we be a people like that? We're going to close with a song that's basically a declaration that Jesus is better. We chose this song specifically because we want to just drive home this point that we want to be a people who just say Jesus is better regardless of the circumstances. We're going to follow Jesus every step of our life. So today, as you close, just join me in that. Would you just declare that Jesus Christ is the one that you want to put all of your hope in so that people can experience Jesus through you, that you would move to being somebody who just says, I am sent into the city of Nashville for the glory of God, and it doesn't matter what happens next for me because Jesus has placed me here to be someone who platforms the glory of God in my community. Let me pray for us. Jesus, as we close out today, I just want to say this. You are better than anything the world has to offer. You are better than my fear. You are better than the things that I'm hoping in that do not bring eternal satisfaction. And Jesus, I embrace the call that you have placed on my life, me, Mike Harder, that you've placed on the life of every single person in this room to go declare that you are the only true God in the city of Nashville. God, would you give us the courage to live that way, boldly, in such a way that our friends and neighbors would come and see that you are good. But that it wouldn't be something that we were boasting about, but rather we would model the cross by coming and dying for our city and giving up our rights and loving our community so much so that people go, wow, that's the kind of God that I want to follow. So allow us to be that. Help us be Christ for our city.